Okay, let's talk about Karl Marx. He's one of those figures in history who's, well, he's incredibly influential, but also super controversial, right? So what did he actually write? What were the big ideas? In this explainer, we're going to get right to it. We're breaking down the key works that, no exaggeration, truly shook the world. Workers of the world unite. I mean, you've probably heard that line before, right? It's everywhere. But it's so much more than just a slogan. It is a powerful, powerful call to action, and it perfectly sums up the revolutionary spirit of the ideas we're about to dive into. And believe me, these ideas definitely went on to change the world. So, first things first. Before we get into the books themselves, we really need to get a handle on the man behind them and the one big idea that drove everything he did. So, who was this guy? Well, Karl Marx was, a lot of things. A German philosopher, an economist, a revolutionary. But the thing that ties it all together, the core of all his work, was this really radical idea that our economic system isn't just about buying and selling stuff. He argued that it's the literal foundation of our entire world. It shapes our politics, our culture, even the way we think about ourselves. And for Marx, the thing that drove all of history forward was something he called class struggle. He basically saw society as being split into two main groups. On one side, you've got the owners, he called them the bourgeoisie, the folks who own the factories, the land, all the stuff that makes stuff. And on the other side, you've got the workers, the proletariat, who have nothing to sell except their own ability to work. And for Marx, that conflict, that tension between these two groups, that was the key to understanding, well, pretty much everything. So, okay, that's the big theory. But how do you turn a theory like that into actual action? Well, it all started with his first major work, a piece of writing that was less like a stuffy academic paper and way more like a political fire starter. Yep, we're talking about the Communist Manifesto. He wrote this with his collaborator, Friedrich Engels, and you gotta understand, this wasn't some huge, dense book. No way. It was a short, punchy pamphlet. It was designed to be easy to read, easy to share, and most importantly, to get people to do something. It lays out that whole history as class struggle idea in really bold terms, and it ends with a very, very clear call for revolution. Okay, so if the manifesto was the fiery call to arms, then his next major work was, well, it was kind of like the technical manual. We're shifting gears here, moving away from the political rally and stepping into the laboratory to really dissect the capitalist system piece by piece. And that work is Das Kapital, which just means capital. This was his life's work, his magnum opus. I mean, it's this massive 3-volume beast of a book. He spent decades on it, literally trying to map the entire DNA of the capitalist system. He wanted to show in scientific detail exactly how it works and why he was so convinced it was destined to eventually fall apart. So at the very heart of this huge book is one simple but profound question. Where does profit really come from? I mean, really? Marx's answer is this key concept he called surplus value. The idea is pretty straightforward when you think about it. Say a worker gets paid for 8 hours of work. Marx would argue that in the first, say, 4 hours, they've produced enough value to cover their own wages. The value they produce in the next 4 hours, that's the surplus value. It's that gap, that extra, unpaid labor. And for Marx, that's where all profit comes from. It's not just some number on a spreadsheet. He saw it as the hidden source of all profit and the very essence of exploitation. But here's something that's really crucial to understand. Marx wasn't just some numbers guy, totally obsessed with the cold, hard mechanics of economics. No, not at all. Decades before he even finished Das Kapital, his earlier writings were focused on something much more personal. He was digging into the psychological toll of the system. This is where we get to the real human cost of it all. Yeah, if you look at his economic and philosophic manuscripts of 1844, which, fun fact, weren't even published until way after he died, you see a younger, maybe more philosophical Marx. And here, he's less concerned with just the economic side of things and more with this deep psychological problem he called alienation. And what is that really? It's this profound feeling of being disconnected, of being a stranger to your own work, and even to yourself. And he broke this down into 4 specific ways it happens. First, he said, workers are alienated from their own labor. Think about it. The work becomes repetitive, soul-crushing, just a means to an end. Second, they're alienated from the product of that labor. You spend all day making something, but you don't own it. You have no connection to it. Third, you become alienated from other people, from society. You're not collaborators, you're competitors, all scrambling for the same jobs. And finally, And this is the one that really hits home. Marx argued we become alienated from ourselves, from our own human nature, our creativity, our potential. We kind of lose who we are in the process. So you see, there are really these two sides to Marx's thought, and they're both super important. On the one hand, you have the huge scientific, systematic breakdown of the economy in Das Kapital, and on the other, you have this incredibly personal, philosophical, and human-focused look at what that system does to us as individuals in his earlier writings. It's really the system versus the self. All right, so let's pull all these threads together. You've got the call to action in the Manifesto, the deep economic critique in Das Kapital, and this profound analysis of the human cost. What does it all add up to? What's the lasting legacy here? When you boil it all down, Marx's entire life's work was really about one thing. He was this revolutionary thinker who wanted to do three things: deeply analyze how capitalism works, explain all of history through this idea of class struggle, and then finally propose communism as the solution to all that exploitation and alienation. That's the whole package, which really leaves us with one big final question for today. You know, whether you agree with Marx's answers or completely reject them, you have to admit something. When you look at our world right now, with the gig economy, with automation and AI on the rise, with these huge levels of inequality, you just have to ask yourself, are the questions he was asking over 150 years ago still relevant? Questions about work, about value, about feeling connected or disconnected? I don't know, maybe they're more relevant than they've ever been. Something to think about.
Today, we are going to unpack one of the most powerful and, let's be honest, controversial political texts ever written, the Communist Manifesto. So, let's dive right in.
Right from its very first sentence, you can tell this isn't some dry academic paper. I mean, it reads like a threat, doesn't it? Marx and Engels are basically declaring that the idea of communism is already so powerful that Europe's ruling class is absolutely terrified. This opening really sets a revolutionary, urgent tone for everything that's about to follow. So, to really get a handle on what's inside this thing, we're going to take a guided tour through its 5 foundational parts. Think of this as our roadmap. We'll start with that dramatic opening and go all the way to its famous final call to action. And that brings us to part 1, the preamble. This is where Marx and Engels establish that communism isn't some fringe idea bubbling up in a corner. No, it's a force that the European elite already recognizes and fears. It's actually a brilliant power move to start a political text this way. They're framing their ideas as something that's already a major player on the world stage. Okay, let's move into the first major section, which, you could argue, contains the absolute core of Marx's entire theory. This is where he really lays out his fundamental view of how human society actually works. And there it is. That's the central claim of the whole manifesto. What Marx is arguing here is that history isn't just a story about great kings or heroic battles or grand ideas. No. If you really want to understand why empires rise and fall, why laws get made, and why societies change, he says you have to look at the conflict between economic classes. So for the modern industrial era that he was living in, Marx identifies 2 main players in this struggle. On one side, you've got the bourgeoisie. These are the owners, the capitalists. And on the other side, you have the proletariat, the workers, the people who have little to sell but their own ability to work. This conflict, he says, is what defines our time. And this all leads to a really profound idea. Marx believed that a society's economic foundation, who owns what, how things are made, that determines everything else about it. Your politics, your culture, your laws, even your ideas, it's all shaped by this economic base. This is the materialist conception of history, and it was revolutionary because it totally pushed aside old notions of divine will or great men as the primary movers of history. Okay, so if history is one big class struggle between workers and owners, where exactly do the communists fit in? Well, this next section clarifies their specific role within that larger conflict. Now, this is a crucial point. Communists don't see themselves as some separate, competing political party. Their goal is to be the most advanced, the most forward-thinking part of the working class movement. Their ultimate aim is to abolish the system of private property. And by that, they mean the private ownership of factories, land, things that create wealth, because they see that as the very root of class divisions. The idea is if you eliminate that, you can unite workers across all national borders. Back when Marx was writing, there were a lot of different flavors of socialism floating around. So in this next section, he takes the time to distinguish his scientific communism from what he saw as these other, less effective rival theories. And this is where Marx really draws a sharp line in the sand. He dismisses what he calls reactionary socialism as just a futile attempt to turn back the clock to some pre-capitalist world. Then he critiques bourgeois socialism, saying it's just trying to put a band-aid on capitalism's wounds without fixing the fundamental problem. And finally, while he respects the ideals of the utopians, he ultimately sees their visions as just impractical fantasies, totally lacking a concrete, revolutionary plan that's grounded in the reality of class struggle. And that brings us to the final and shortest section of the manifesto. After all the theory, after all the history, this is the practical conclusion. This is the, okay, so what do we do now part. The instruction here is incredibly clear and direct. Communists should actively support any movement, anywhere in the world, that challenges the status quo. The basic idea is to help push society towards a revolutionary breaking point, all while keeping that ultimate goal of a classless society front and center. And it all builds to this. This is arguably the most famous political slogan in history. It's the final, powerful rallying cry, a call for the global working class to recognize their shared interests and to act as one single, unified force. So that's our tour of the manifesto. But the big question remains, right? Why are we still talking about this document over 175 years later? Let's take a quick look at its enormous and very controversial legacy. Honestly, its influence is just hard to overstate. It fundamentally changed how we analyze history, giving us this lens of class struggle. For better or worse, it became the foundational text for revolutions that completely reshaped nations in the 20th century. And its ideas have spread so far beyond politics, shaping entire fields of study from sociology and economics to art history and literary criticism. And that brings us to our final thought. Whether you see it as a blueprint for liberation or as a dire warning from history, the ideas in the Communist Manifesto undeniably continue to spark debate. And that really leaves us with a fascinating question. Why does this 19th century text still resonate so powerfully in our world today?
Okay, today we're diving into one of the heaviest, most talked about books in history, Karl Marx's Das Kapital. I mean, for over 150 years, this thing has been shaping economies, sparking revolutions, you name it. Our mission here is to crack this dense book open and really get to the core of what Marx was actually trying to say. Let's get into it. So you've got to wonder, right? Why on earth is a book about 19th century economics, we're talking steam engines and telegrams, still causing arguments about stuff like globalization and financial meltdowns today? Well, that's the big puzzle we're going to unpack. Because Das Kapital isn't just a dusty history book, it's a deep dive critique of an economic system. And as we'll find out, a lot of people think its ideas have never been more relevant. So, to make sense of it all, we're going to break it down into 5 key parts. First, we'll look at the secret life of a simple commodity. Then, we'll fire up the engine of capitalism. After that, we'll check out the rules of the game, explore the system's built-in glitches, and finally, we'll ask that big question. Why should we still care about this book today? All right, Section 1, The Secret of a Commodity. Now, what's fascinating is that Marx starts this whole massive analysis, not with governments or giant factories, but with the most basic thing you can imagine, a single product, a commodity. For him, this was like the DNA of the whole system, a tiny building block that held all the secrets.
So what exactly is a commodity? Well, in Marx's view, it's pretty simple. It's any object that's made specifically to be sold in the market. It's not just a thing, it's a thing for sale. So your smartphone, the coffee you bought this morning, if it was produced to be exchanged, yep, it's a commodity. Now here's where it gets interesting. Marx says every single commodity has like a split personality. On the one hand, you have its use value. That's the practical stuff. A coat keeps you warm, simple. But on the other hand, it has an exchange value. That's what it's worth compared to other things. So a coat might be worth, say, 10 loaves of bread. And that made Marx wonder, what hidden thing do a coat and a loaf of bread have in common that lets us even make that comparison? And boom, here's the first big reveal. That hidden substance, according to Marx, is human labor. But not the specific skill of a tailor or a baker. He called it abstract human labor, just the raw expenditure of human effort and time. He argued that the real value of a product comes down to the average amount of work time that society needs to make. This brings us to one of his most famous and, frankly, coolest concepts, commodity fetishism. It sounds weird, but the idea is that in the market, all we see are relationships between things, like the price tag on a pair of jeans. What gets totally hidden is the real human relationship between you and the person who made them. That human labor becomes invisible, and we start treating products and money as if they have magical powers of their own.
All right, part 2, the engine of capitalism. Now that we've dissected the commodity, let's see how it actually moves through the economy. What's the real goal here? What's driving this whole machine forward?
So Marx points out two totally different circuits. The first is simple: commodity, money, commodity. You sell something you have, like a coat, to get money to buy something you need, like bread. The whole point is to use the thing you buy. But capitalism, he says, flips the script. It's money, commodity, more money. You start with money, use it to make something, and then sell that thing for more money than you started with. That little dash at the end, that M prime, changes everything. The goal isn't just using stuff anymore, it's about the endless accumulation of more and more money.
But wait a second. Where does that more money, that profit, actually come from? I mean, if everyone's just trading things for their true value, how can anyone end up with more money? Marx's answer is a concept he calls surplus value. He said it's the extra value that workers create that goes above and beyond what they get paid in wages. For him, this is the secret sauce of all profit.
And the key that unlocks this whole puzzle is one very, very special commodity: labor power. You see, a capitalist doesn't just buy a worker's time. They buy the worker's ability to work for a whole day. And here's the trick. That ability, that labor power, can create more value than it costs. Think about it. A worker might create enough value to cover their wages in the first 4 hours of their shift, but they keep working for another 4. According to Marx, the value they create in those extra hours, that's the surplus value. That's the profit.
Okay, on to Section 3, the rules of the game. This non-stop chase for surplus value isn't just a business plan. Marx believed it actually sets the rules for how our entire society works. It's not just happening in a factory, it's shaping everything.
He called it the general law of capitalist accumulation. It sounds kind of intimidating, but the idea is actually pretty simple. Because of competition, businesses are always forced to get more productive. And how do you do that? Well, usually by investing in better technology and more machines. Over time, this means more and more money goes into stuff, what Marx called constant capital, and less, relatively speaking, goes into hiring actual people, or variable capital.
Now, a direct result of this race for efficiency is something Marx gave a pretty grim name: the Industrial Reserve Army. As machines replace people, the system is constantly creating a pool of unemployed folks. And he argued this isn't some accident or a bug in the system, it's a necessary feature. It gives businesses a ready supply of workers when they want to expand, and, maybe more importantly, it helps keep wages down for everyone who does have a job.
Okay, Section 4 is where things get really dramatic. We're looking at capitalism's built-in contradictions. See, Marx didn't think this system was some perfectly smooth-running machine. He argued that the very things that make it so dynamic also create deep tensions that can lead to major instability and crisis.
And this brings us to one of his most debated ideas ever: the tendency of the rate of profit to fall. Okay, let's walk through the logic. If, as Marx says, profit ultimately comes from the surplus value of labor, and if businesses are constantly investing more in machines and less in labor, then the overall rate of profit, which is based on your total investment, is going to have a natural tendency to go down over time. It's a huge contradiction. The very drive to maximize profit by using technology ends up, in the long run, squeezing the rate of profit itself.
But, and this is a really big but, Marx wasn't predicting some simple automatic collapse. He was more clever than that. He also laid out a bunch of counteracting forces, things that could push back against this tendency. You could make people work harder or for longer hours. You could push wages down. You could find cheaper machines or raw materials or expand into new markets overseas. So it's not a doomsday clock. It's more like a constant underlying pressure, a source of tension and struggle in the system.
So that brings us to our last section. Why even bother with Marx today? After all this, how should we look at Das Kapital now? It's really important to be honest about both the ideas that still hit home and the very real, very powerful criticisms of his work.
And let's be clear, Das Kapital has been hit with some heavy critiques. For starters, most mainstream economists today flat out reject his labor theory of value. That whole tendency of the rate of profit to fall, yeah, people are still fighting about whether that's true. And while inequality is obviously a huge issue, his predictions that workers would just get poorer and poorer didn't quite pan out in many parts of the world.
Plus, newer critics have pointed out some massive blind spots, like how he completely ignores the unpaid labor done in the home, mostly by women, or the devastating ecological cost of nonstop production. And yet, after all of that, there's a reason this book just won't go away. This quote, I think, really gets to the heart of it all. For Marx, capital isn't just money or factories. It's a social relation. It's a particular way that we, as people, relate to each other, but it's hidden behind the buying and selling of things. His entire goal was to pull back that curtain and show us the human relationships underneath it all. So, we're left with this big question at the end. Is Das Kapital just an old relic? A piece of 19th century thinking that we've moved past? Or is it still a vital tool, flaws and all, for trying to understand our own world? A world that is still very much wrestling with inequality, with crises, and with that relentless drive for profit. The debate is far from over. And you know what? That might just be the book's most lasting legacy.
All right, let's dive in. We're about to decode some of the most influential and, let's be honest, often misunderstood ideas from Karl Marx. So forget the dense textbooks for a minute. My goal here is to make these huge concepts about social change totally, completely clear.
And let's kick things off with a big question. Have you ever noticed that history doesn't really feel like a smooth, straight line? It's more like a series of clashes and struggles. Marx certainly thought so. So what's the engine driving all that conflict? Well, let's find out. To really get to the bottom of this, we're going to unpack 3 key ideas. First, we'll look at the engine of change itself. Then, we'll see the kind of map that engine draws across human history. And finally, we'll explore the powerful illusion that can hide that whole map from our view. Okay, first up is the engine itself. It's a big phrase, dialectical materialism. But don't worry, we're going to break it down because this idea is the foundation for everything else we're going to talk about.
So what is it? Well, Marx and his collaborator Friedrich Engels came up with it. And look, this wasn't just some abstract theory they cooked up in an ivory tower. They saw it as a real, practical tool for understanding how the world actually works.
That big, clunky term, it's actually made of 2 pretty simple ideas. The materialist part just means we're focusing on real, tangible stuff. Our jobs, the economy, the things we make, not just lofty ideas. Then you have the dialectical part. And that just means that change happens because of struggle, the clash of opposing forces.
And if you look for them, you see these clashes, these contradictions everywhere. Think about the tension between a company wanting to maximize profits and its workers wanting a decent wage. For Marx, this isn't just a simple disagreement. No way. It's a fundamental conflict that's literally hardwired into the system.
And here's the real kicker. For Marx, you can't solve these real-world problems by just having a philosophical debate. Because the problem is rooted in our material reality, the solution has to be too. It means you actually have to change the economic and social systems themselves. Okay, so if that's the engine of change, how does it play out across history? Well, that brings us to our next big idea, historical materialism. It's like we found the engine, and now we're looking at the blueprint it's been following this whole time.
This is really Marx's grand theory of history. The core idea is that the most important thing about any society, the thing that truly defines it, is how it produces stuff. You know, how we make the things we need to survive, from our food to our iPhones. That process shapes literally everything else. Marx saw society as having 2 layers. Think of it like a building. At the bottom, you have the base. That's the foundation, the economy, the technology, the factories. Then, everything else, our laws, our politics, our art, our culture, that's the superstructure. And it's all built on top of and shaped by that economic base. In other words, our culture tends to reflect our economic reality. So if you want to understand the big turning points in history, according to this theory, you don't just look at the kings and queens, you have to look deeper at the economic shifts and the struggles between different social classes that were happening underneath it all.
Now, this leads to a really radical conclusion. I mean, if history is always being pushed forward by these economic forces and their internal conflicts, then why would we think it suddenly stopped? From this point of view, capitalism isn't the end of the story, it's just another chapter.
But hang on. If this historical engine is always running, why isn't it obvious to everyone? Why don't we all see it? Well, that takes us to our final concept, a really powerful social illusion that's known as false consciousness. This term, which Engels used, describes something fascinating. It's when the people who are most disadvantaged by a system actually start to believe in the very ideas that justify their own disadvantage. It's what makes a deeply unequal system feel, well, normal.
maybe even fair.
It's a really good question, right? Why on earth would anyone buy into an ideology that works against them? Well, the idea here is that the values of the ruling class don't just stay with the ruling class. They get broadcast everywhere, through media, through education, until they become the dominant, common-sense ideas for everyone.
I mean, take this belief. You've probably heard it a million times. The idea that wealth is purely a reward for hard work. Now, on the surface, it sounds reasonable. But what it does is it completely papers over all the structural advantages and disadvantages that are already baked into the system. It's a way of making inequality look like a fair race.
And so what false consciousness does, ultimately, is act as a barrier. It's like a fog that prevents people from seeing their shared situation and their collective interests. It stops them from developing what Marx called true class consciousness, a real awareness of where they stand.
Whew, okay, we have covered a lot of ground. So let's pull it all together right now with a quick, simple cheat sheet.
So, to nail this down, dialectical materialism, that's the engine. Change happens through real-world conflict. Historical materialism, that's the map. History is shaped by economics. And false consciousness, well, that's the illusion, the fog that keeps us from reading that map clearly.
And that's really the crucial thing to get here. These aren't just three random ideas. They link together perfectly. You have a theory of change, you have its application across all of history, and you have the psychological veil that can hide the whole process from view.
Which leaves us with one last question to chew on. If false consciousness was a powerful force back then, what are the illusions shaping our world right now? What are the common sense ideas we all accept that might be preventing us from seeing the whole picture? Something to think about.